She took the one thing I had asked her not to touch, and she did it the night before my wedding. And she did it with a reason that sounded like an accident and was not an accident. And I want to be clear about that before anything else, because the difference between a mistake and a choice is whether it happens once, and my sister Lauren had been making this particular kind of choice my entire life, and the dress was just the version of it that finally had witnesses. And when I walked down the aisle the following afternoon in something Lauren had never seen and could never have predicted my groom. Thomas stood at the end of that aisle, and his eyes filled, and he pressed his hand to his mouth. And my sister was sitting in the third row in a dress she had stolen from a woman who had already decided she was done being stolen from, and I looked at Thomas and I walked toward him. And I did not look at Lauren once, because Lauren had already been handled. And what was happening at that altar was only about us, and the dress I was wearing was the proof of that. And the story of how I got there is the story of finally understanding that the best response to someone who takes from you is not to chase what they took, it is to show them what they cannot touch. Oh hey, welcome back you guys! Okay, so if this is your first time here, I cannot believe this is the video that found you first. Honestly, buckle up because this one is personal. My name is Sophie Hartwell, and I am 31 years old, and I got married 8 months ago. And the week before my wedding, my sister Lauren took my dress from the garment bag hanging in my childhood bedroom at my mother's house, where I had brought it for the final fitting. And when I say took, I mean she put it on and wore it to an engagement party for her friend on Thursday evening, and when I found the empty garment bag on Friday morning and called her, she said she had borrowed it and would return it by Saturday, and my wedding was Saturday, and she returned it Saturday morning at 9 a.m. with a small tear along the left seam and a stain near the hem that was the color of red wine. And Lauren said, "I am so sorry, Sophie. It was an accident." And I looked at the dress, and I looked at my sister. And I said, "Okay, Lauren," and I hung up, and I called Thomas, and I said, "The dress has been damaged," and he said, "How bad?" And I said, "Bad enough." And he said, "What do you need?" And I said, "I need 3 hours." And he said, "You have whatever you need," and I hung up, and I sat on the floor of my hotel room, and I gave myself 11 minutes to feel everything that was true about that moment. And then I stood up, and I made a phone call that I had actually made 6 months earlier, when I had first understood that Lauren was the kind of person who needed a contingency plan built around her. Here is what Lauren did not know. 6 months before the wedding, I had been at a bridal market with my friend Cara, who is a fashion designer, and Cara had shown me a sample piece she had been working on, which was not a traditional wedding dress. It was an ivory silk slip dress with hand-embroidered details along the neckline, and it was the most quietly beautiful thing I had seen in a long time. And I had said, "Cara, this is extraordinary." And she had said, "It's not for sale. It's a sample." And I had said, "If I ever need an alternative to my actual dress, would you let me borrow this?" And Cara had looked at me very carefully and said, "Sophie, why would you need an alternative?" And I had said, "Because I have a sister." And Cara had laughed and said, "Yes, you can borrow it." And we had not spoken about it again until Saturday morning when I called her and said, "Cara, I need the ivory dress." And she said, "I'll be at your hotel in 40 minutes. The reason I had a contingency dress is the same reason I have a contingency for most things that involve Lauren, which is that Lauren has been borrowing without asking and returning damaged and calling it an accident since we were children. And the specific history goes like this. When I was 16, Lauren borrowed my camera for a school trip and returned it with a cracked lens and said she had dropped it. And our mother said these things happen. And when I was 19, Lauren borrowed a bracelet our grandmother had given me to wear to a formal and lost it, and said she had not realized it was sentimental, and our mother said she didn't mean to. And when I was 24, Lauren borrowed my car for what she said was one afternoon, and kept it for 4 days and returned it with a dent in the rear bumper and said a parking lot had done it. And our mother said Lauren is just a little careless, and I had stood in my mother's kitchen at 24 and looked at the dent and thought about the lens and the bracelet. And I had understood something that our mother had never quite wanted to understand, which was that careless is not a personality, it is a permission. And Lauren had been given that permission so many times that she no longer noticed she was using it, and the dress was just the most recent item on a list I had been keeping since I was 16. What Lauren expected on Saturday morning was chaos. And I want to be honest about that because I know my sister and I know what she expected, which was tears and a ruined morning and frantic phone calls and possibly a postponement, and what she expected was to be at the center of the crisis she had created, the way she had always been at the center of the crises she created. Because Lauren being forgiven and accommodated was a dynamic she had been living inside for so long, it felt like weather, and what she got instead was silence. And I think the silence was the first indication that something was different, because I did not call my mother, and I did not call Lauren back, and I did not post anything, and I did not ask anyone to intervene. And I put on Cara's ivory dress in my hotel room, with Cara and my best friend Jess and Thomas's sister Maya, who had driven over with a sewing kit just in case. And we did my hair and we did my makeup, and at 2:15 p.m. I walked into that ceremony. And I want to tell you about Thomas's face, because Thomas's face is the whole point. And when I appeared at the end of the aisle in the ivory silk with the embroidered neckline, Thomas put his hand over his mouth and his eyes filled, and he shook his head slowly, the way people shake their heads when something is more than they expected. And later he told me he had been so worried about me that morning. And when he saw me walk in looking like that, he said, "I thought you were the most composed person I had ever seen in my life." And I said, "I had a contingency." And he said, "Of course you did." And he laughed and I laughed and we got married. Lauren was in the third row in my original dress, which she had returned that morning with the stain and the tear, and which she had apparently decided to then wear to my wedding. And I saw her when I walked in, and I processed the information, which was that my sister had damaged my dress and then worn it to my wedding, and I noted it, and I looked at Thomas, and I kept walking. And the thing about the mirror is that it does not require you to hold it up yourself. It just requires you to step out of the way and let people see what is already there. And every person in that room who saw Lauren in my dress and saw me in something entirely different had exactly enough information to understand what had happened. And I did not have to say a single word. And my mother came to me at the reception and she said, "Sophie, where did you get that dress?" And I said, "A friend made it for me." And she said, "It's beautiful." And she paused and she said, "Lauren told me the dress had an accident." And I said, "I know, Mom." And she said, "Are you upset?" And I said, "I was for 11 minutes this morning." And then I got dressed, and she looked at me for a moment, and I think she understood something that she had been slowly approaching for 31 years. And she said, "I think I owe you more than one apology." And I said, "One is fine for today, Mom." And she said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Thank you." And we had champagne. And it was genuinely the best conversation my mother and I have had in a decade, because something about watching her younger daughter show up in a stranger's dress to a wedding she had sabotaged made the pattern visible in a way that all my previous explanations had not managed. And Lauren left the reception early, and I did not notice until someone mentioned it. And I did not go after her, and I did not call the next day. And I have spoken to Lauren twice in 8 months, both times briefly, and both times about logistics, and not about the dress, and not about any of it. And what I gave Lauren was exactly what Lauren had been giving me for 15 years, which was the experience of reaching for something and finding it already gone, and the experience of showing up somewhere and realizing too late that you are wearing the wrong thing, and the experience of being on the outside of a moment that was never going to include you, no matter what you borrowed. And I did not plan that specifically. I just stopped compensating, and the mirror did the rest. And Thomas and I have the photographs from that day, and in every single one, I am wearing ivory silk with embroidered details. And I am looking at my husband, and I look like exactly who I am, which is a woman who had a contingency and used it, and whose sister is in some of those photographs in the third row in a damaged dress with a wine stain near the hem, and the photographs tell the whole story without a single caption. And I think that is the most complete thing I have ever done.